Welcome to first part of Chapter 18 on the cardiovascular system, and we'll be dealing today with a tour of the heart. What we have to appreciate about the cardiovascular system is that it's a solution to a problem in evolution. Remember that early on in the history of life on planet Earth, conditions were relatively uniform, and as a result, living things showed very little variability in their characteristics because they only needed a certain set of tools in order to survive. What happened next is that the planet began to change. Parts of it began to dry, parts of it began to cool, parts of it began to become saltier. Essentially, the environment became more heterogeneous. And in order to adapt to these changing conditions, life had to evolve into a more complex form. One of the first adaptations were that single-celled organisms formed loose associations called biofilms that allowed them to take advantage of their surroundings in a manner that a single cell or a single organism could not. These biofilms were made up of groups of organisms, some of which could find and build shelter, some of which could acquire food, some of which could defend against attack, and the result was that the team, the association, was able to withstand more environmental changes than single organisms living on their lonesome. And this set the stage for the next phase in evolution, which was multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms, by their very nature, are made up of different tissue types which can do different jobs and as a result provide for greater adaptability for that organism than a single-celled organism. As a result, we ended up with a more complex body plan, and we had to figure out a way to deliver oxygen and nutrients to tissues that were distant from the digestive and the respiratory systems of those organisms. And that's why the circulatory system evolved. It's the body's pizza delivery and waste removal service. It's important in providing nutrients and oxygen and removing carbon dioxide and other waste products. It's a conduit for defense cells, the white blood cells that defend against attack by pathogens. It's a delivery system for hormones. It is a mechanism for maintaining the body's pH, and it also regulates the body's temperature and fluid balance. So it's critically important that, number one, the blood, which is a liquid connective tissue, circulate, okay? And number two, that it contains components that allow it to perform these tasks adequately. The pump that drives this in the human body and in all organisms that are more highly advanced than single-celled organisms, pretty much, is the heart. Okay? Even something as primitive as an insect has a heart that pumps the equivalent of blood in the insect called hemolymph around the body so the organism can live. In the human, the heart is a four-chambered pump. The right side of the heart gets oxygen-poor blood from tissues, and it pumps it to the lungs to get rid of carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen in the pulmonary circuit, which is extremely short because the heart and the lungs are very close to each other, while the left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumps it out to the body through the systemic circuit. The receiving chambers of the heart are the right and the left atrium. The right atrium gets blood that returns from the body, and the left atrium gets blood that returns from the lungs. As a result, the left atrium is always filled with oxygenated blood, and the right atrium is always filled with deoxygenated blood. The lower chambers of the heart are the right and the left ventricle. The right ventricle pumps blood that it receives from the right atrium through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, from there to the pulmonary arteries, and from there it goes to the lungs, where that blood is going to pick up oxygen and release carbon dioxide. The left ventricle receives blood from the left atrium and pumps it through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which delivers oxygen-rich blood to the entire body. And you can see a diagram of the two circuits here. Okay? Oxygen-poor blood coming back from regions below and above the heart enters the right atrium. There are actually three vessels that empty into here: the superior and inferior vena cava and the coronary sinus. The superior vena cava drains blood from everywhere above the heart into the heart. The inferior vena cava everywhere below the heart into the heart, and the coronary sinus drains blood from the heart itself into the right atrium. We pass through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps that blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, which carry the blood to the lungs, where it becomes oxygenated and releases most of its carbon dioxide. And then it heads back via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From the left atrium, we flow through the bicuspid, also known as the mitral valve, into the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle ejects the blood through the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta. And from there we go through the entire body. You'll note that the vessels get smaller and smaller the further away from the heart they travel. And the reason for this is that in order to effectively deliver the important material in the blood to the tissues, we need a tremendous surface area, and we do that by generating large numbers of small vessels designed specifically for exchange, known as capillaries. The capillaries are actually so numerous in the body that we don't even bother naming and locating them. Your heart is about the size of your fist and is located in the mediastinum, right behind the sternum, between the second and the fifth intercostal space, and it rests on top of the diaphragm. 2/3 of the heart is to the left of the mid-sternal line. It's also anterior to the vertebral column. The base leans towards the right shoulder, and the apex points towards the left hip. The apical impulse can be felt between the 5th and 6th ribs below the left nipple. For those of you who want a reference point, this is where you put your hand over your heart when you say the Pledge of Allegiance. And what you're feeling there, that apical impulse, is the result of a region of the heart known as the point of maximal intensity. Okay? It tends to generate a rotating motion when the heart beats. So you can see the location of the heart here relative to the sternum, and you can see where the apical impulse is felt, and the location of the diaphragm. And here you can see a view from the top, right? Note how close the heart is associated with the lungs, okay? And the reason for this is to make it extremely easy for deoxygenated blood to reach the lungs and pick up oxygen and release CO2 and return back to the heart in a relatively short time, so that it can then be ejected out to the body. The pericardium is a double-walled sac that surrounds the heart, peri meaning around and cardium meaning the heart. It has two layers: a visceral pericardium that clings to the heart itself, and a parietal pericardium that clings to the pericardial chamber. And it's filled with a lubricating pericardial fluid that allows the heart to pump blood without irritating, inflaming, and scarring itself. The fibrous pericardium is the most superficial layer. It anchors the heart to surrounding structures, and it also prevents the heart from overfilling. If the heart were to overfill, you could potentially damage the heart muscle tissue and compromise the pumping action of the heart. So that's the parietal and the visceral pericardium. The visceral layer is sometimes called the epicardium, as it lies on the exterior surface of the heart. And that fluid that's produced is generated between the parietal and the visceral pericardium in order to lubricate the heart while it beats. Occasionally what can happen is that this layer can inflame. And what happens then is that you generate a painful condition known as angina pectoris. You can pick up a pericardial friction rub with a stethoscope. One condition that can lead to this is called cardiac tamponade, where excess fluid can accumulate in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart and limiting its ability to pump blood. The heart has 3 layers in its wall: the epicardium, also known as the visceral pericardium, the myocardium, which is cardiac muscle tissue, and the endocardium, which is endothelial tissue. The epicardium is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, while the myocardium is made up of bundles of myocardial cells. Cardiac muscle tissue is unique in that it is striated and highly branched and has 1 nucleus per cell, but the myocardium, the cells that comprise it, are composed of cells that are attached to each other by structures called intercalated discs, which are combinations of desmosomes and gap junctions. The desmosomes hold the heart muscle tissue together so that it doesn't rupture while the heart is pumping blood, while the gap junctions are tunnels between adjacent myocardial cells that allow the flow of current. That results in electrical signals traveling very rapidly from cell to cell once they're initiated by the heart's pacemaker, known as the SA node. And as that depolarizing wave passes through those cells via these electrical junctions, that's followed by a uniform contraction of the heart wall. These spiral bundles of cardiomyocytes are attached to the cardiac skeleton, which is a layer of connective tissue and anchors the cardiac muscle cells and supports the great vessels and valves. And it also has an insulating property so that the action potentials that radiate across the heart wall only go in a certain direction. The endocardium is continuous with the endothelia, that's the interior wall of the blood vessels. It lines the heart chambers and it covers the cardiac skeleton of the valves. And again, you can see the layers here. Okay, again, the parietal pericardium, the visceral pericardium, pericardial fluid would be here, fibrous pericardium that anchors everything, myocardium, endocardium, right? And those are the spiral bundles of cardiomyocytes wrapped around the fibrous skeleton of the heart, okay? So you can kind of see, or maybe you can intuit by looking at the way that these fibers travel, that when the heart actually pumps, it spins a little bit on its axis in order to eject the blood, okay? And that's what you're feeling there at the point of maximal intensity down by the apex of the heart when you put your right hand over your heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance. The 4 chambers of the heart consist of the 2 superior atria, which are the receiving chambers, and the ejecting chambers, which are the 2 inferior ventricles. The ventricles are much larger than the atria and more muscular because they do more work. The atria work with gravity to send blood into the lower chambers, and as a result, the thickness of their walls is insignificant compared to that of the ventricles. The interatrial septum separates the 2 atria from each other and contains an indentation called the fossa ovalis, which is a remnant of a hole that used to exist between the 2 atria during fetal circulation called the foramen ovale. The interventricular septum separates the 2 ventricles, and this results then in a separation of oxygenated from deoxygenated blood, which is critical for the heart to be effective in pumping blood. We should also note that the valves that lead from chamber to chamber and from chamber to great vessel are one-way valves. They only permit the flow of blood in a single direction, and that improves the efficiency of the pump. If the valves were defective, then it would be more difficult to pump the blood around the body in a manner that delivers the maximum amount of oxygenated blood to the tissues that desperately need it. You can see here that this view of the heart, we're looking from front to back here, shows you the location of the chambers and the valves. Okay, right atrium, tricuspid valve. These little things, the chordae tendineae, anchor the flaps of this AV valve to the floor of the ventricle so that they don't prolapse back into the previous chamber when the pressure in the ventricle builds. And then the semilunar valves, which only open into the great vessel. Here's the pulmonary semilunar. It only opens into the pulmonary trunk. When the pressure in the pulmonary trunk is greater than the pressure in the ventricle, the flaps on these valves will slap shut on each other, and the geometry of the flaps makes it so that they don't prolapse into the ventricle, again, under normal circumstances. And then you see the interventricular septum here, okay? And then on the other side, we've got the left atrium, the bicuspid valve, and the left ventricle. And what you'll notice with the left ventricle is that the wall is much thicker than the walls of all the other chambers, and that's reflective of the fact that it does the most work, since it has to pump the blood to the entire body. And the aortic semilunar valve is kind of tucked behind here, and again only opens in one direction, into the aorta, and allows the blood to flow from the left ventricle to this large vessel which delivers the blood to the rest of the body. You can see the great vessels here: superior and inferior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk, a left and the right pulmonary arteries, and then the aorta continues down behind the heart, through the thoracic cavity, through the diaphragm, and then through the abdominal pelvic cavity, and it continues all the way down towards the lower limbs, where it will then split into the common iliac arteries and the median sacral artery. The coronary sulcus is a groove on the front of the heart that encircles the junction between the atria and the ventricles, while the anterior interventricular sulcus is the anterior position of the interventricular septum. The posterior interventricular sulcus is its counterpart on the back of the heart. So there's a little tiny groove on the front and the back surface that tells you where the wall between the two lower chambers is. The auricles are appendages that fill with blood that allow the atria to expand when they receive blood from the body in the case of the right atria, and the lungs in the case of the left atria. They swell up like balloons. When the atria empty, they look like little ear flaps hanging off the outside surface of the atria. The right atrium contains pectinate muscles. Posterior and anterior regions of this chamber are separated by the crista terminalis. The left atrium contains pectinate muscles only in the auricles. Okay? So what are pectinate muscles? They're just ridges of cardiac muscle tissue in the wall of the chamber that aid in the pumping action. The atria are small and thin-walled, and they don't do much to push blood because they don't have to. They work with gravity, and the gravity does most of the passive ventricular filling, about 70% or so. The three veins that empty into the right atrium we already detailed. The four pulmonary veins that empty into the left atrium are the two pair of right and left pulmonary veins. Most of the volume of the heart is made up of the lower chambers, the ventricles. They're also called the discharging chambers because they're capable of ejecting blood out of the organ and into the great vessels. The right ventricle makes up most of the anterior surface of the heart, while the left ventricle makes up most of the posterior-inferior surface. Trabeculae carneae are irregular ridges on the muscle on the walls of the ventricles, so they're the counterpart to the pectinate muscles in the atria. The papillary muscles are finger-like projections that are attached to the chordae tendineae, which are attached to the flaps of the AV valves and stabilize their position so that they don't prolapse back into the atria when the pressure in the ventricles builds to the point where the AV valves will close. The ventricles have thicker walls in the atria because they do more work. They're the actual pumps that eject blood into either the body or towards the lungs. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk while the left pumps it into the aorta. And remember again that one-way valves at the base of each of these vessels ensure that the blood only flows in a single direction. You can see the anterior surface of the heart here. The auricles, again, are the little flaps that hang off the edges of the atria. You can see the anterior interventricular sulcus here. This would be the right ventricle. Down here would be the left ventricle. Aorta, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, superior and inferior vena cava. These are going to be the right pulmonary veins. These are the left pulmonary veins. And this little thing is a remnant of the ductus arteriosus, which was a bypass that existed in the fetal circulation that allowed oxygenated blood to flow from the pulmonary trunk into the aorta only in the fetal system. This closes at birth in order to complete the separation of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood on either side of the heart as it sends it out either to the pulmonary or the systemic circuit. You can see the heart also has adipose tissue on its surface to pad and protect it. And then you've got some major vessels that feed blood to the heart. The right and the left coronary arteries come off the base of the aorta and travel under these little valve flaps in the auricles. The left coronary artery splits into the circumflex and the anterior interventricular, while the right coronary artery continues, gives off the right marginal artery, which travels down the right anterior surface of the heart, and then continues on around to the back of the heart. You can see the actual vessels here with the pericardium removed from this heart, and you can see a look inside here, noting the chordae tendineae and the valve flaps. The heart valves are the only thing that ensure unidirectional flow of blood through the heart, and they open and close in response to pressure changes. The two atrioventricular valves separate the upper atrial chambers from the lower ventricles and thus prevent backflow into the atria when the ventricular pressure builds enough to close the valve. The tricuspid valve is the right AV valve, while the bicuspid is the left AV valve. It's sometimes referred to as the mitral valve because of its resemblance to a bishop's mitre, the large pointed hat that is sometimes worn in religious ceremonies. The chordae tendineae anchor the cusps to the papillary muscles and again ensure that the valves don't prolapse back into the previous chamber. And you can see here a diagram of how the blood flows through the AV valves, right? As the pressure builds in the atria, the right and left AV valves will open in response to the pressure up here being greater than the pressure down below. 70% of the blood will then flow through these AV valves. At the end of that process, a tiny squeeze from each of the atria will eject the remaining 30% or so of blood that's going to fill the lower chamber. And then that'll be followed by a buildup of pressure in each of the ventricles as they begin to squeeze. Initially, the volume of the ventricles won't change while the pressure goes up, and eventually what will happen is the pressure will build to the point where both of the semilunar valves will open and the blood will be ejected into the great vessels. But throughout this period, the AV valves remain closed because the pressures in the ventricles are greater than the pressures in the atria, and that holds the door shut. Once the pressure in the ventricles is greater than the pressure in the great vessels, the semilunar valves will open and the blood will flow out of the heart and into the great vessels towards either the lungs or the body. The semilunar valves prevent backflow into the ventricles, and they also respond to pressure changes, and those are the two valves, and we've seen here how they work, right? As the pressure in the ventricles builds, it'll eventually be greater than the pressure in the great vessels, and that will open those doorways, and the blood will leave the discharging chambers. And then what will happen after that is that the ventricles will actually begin to relax and dilate, and the pressure in the ventricles will drop below the pressure in the great vessels, and that results in a backflow of blood towards the heart, but it doesn't re-enter the heart again because the semilunar valves are slapped shut, again under normal circumstances. If we remove the atria, you can see the valves and how they open, right? You can see the tricuspid and the bicuspid here, and you can see the semilunars here. Okay? Note that the AV valves only open into the ventricles, and the semilunar valves only open into the great vessels. And there's a look at an actual heart with the chambers removed. And there's a look inside the ventricle, and you can see the papillary muscles and chordae tendineae, which stabilize the position of both the mitral and the tricuspid valve, so that prolapse isn't possible. And you can see here in a sagittal section of the heart some of the same features. Again, notice the thickness of the left ventricular wall compared to the walls of all the other chambers. Two conditions can weaken the heart: an incompetent valve, which would be one that leaks blood back into the previous chamber when it's supposed to be closed, and that causes the heart to have to repump the same blood, and stenosis, which is a narrowing of the valve and increases the resistance that blood encounters as it has to flow through a tinier opening, and that causes the chamber that's upstream of the stenosis to hypertrophy as it has to work harder and harder to pump the blood, and that can eventually result in a weakening of that chamber. Hypertrophy is the increase in mass of the muscles associated with that activity as a result of overuse. We can replace valves with artificial valves or valves that we harvest from cadavers or animal donors. In the pulmonary circuit, we have the right atrium sending blood through the tricuspid into the right ventricle, which sends blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, and they deliver the blood to the lungs. The lungs then deliver the blood to the pulmonary veins. The blood at this point now has a high oxygen content and appears bright red. And then the pulmonary veins empty this oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium. The systemic circuit consists of the left atrium sending blood through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, which then exerts force on that blood, closing the bicuspid valve and eventually opening the aortic semilunar valve. The blood then flows into the aorta and from there to the entire body. And that's the systemic circulation. And you can see it here. Okay? So it's all about pressure changes. Okay? Now, once the blood arrives at the tissues and the systemic circulation, it releases oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide. And so on the return trip back to the heart, the blood will actually be a dark red, which appears blue through the white walls of the veins. Remember that arteries and veins reflect simply the direction of blood relative to the location of the heart. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart, while veins always carry blood back towards the heart. Equal volumes of blood are always ejected under normal circumstances with each beat of the heart. We should note that the left ventricle has walls that are 3 times thicker than the right because it has to work against much greater resistance, while the right ventricle is considerably less muscular but works against much less resistance since the distance between the heart and the lungs is very short. As long as this holds, then the amount of blood entering the heart and exiting the heart serves the circulatory system adequately. In the event that one side of the heart slows with respect to the other, blood will accumulate. If the right side of the heart slows pumping of blood relative to the left side of the heart, then blood will accumulate in the systemic tissues and we'll see peripheral edema in the wrists and the ankles. In the event that the left side of the heart slows pumping with respect to the right side, we will initially see edema in the lungs because, again, the blood's not being pumped into the systemic circuit quickly enough, and that looks like a whiteout on a chest x-ray. You can see here the relative thickness of the two walls of the right and the left ventricle. Notice how much thinner the walls of the right ventricle are compared to the left. The coronary circulation is simply the flow of blood to the heart organ itself. It's delivered when the heart is relaxed. The left ventricle receives most of the blood supply. The arterial supply varies from individual to individual, and there are a lot of anastomoses between parallel vessels that either drain blood from or deliver blood to the heart, and this is to ensure adequate perfusion. The only place that this breaks down is the right and the left coronary arteries, which branch off the base of the aorta and do not have extensive anastomoses. This is why, if they become blocked, you can anticipate damage to the myocardium that is often permanent. This is why they get the nickname the Widowmaker. Arteries that deliver blood to the heart itself pop off the base of the aorta, and they actually fill when the heart is in diastole, and that relaxes the pressure on those vessels coming off the base of the aorta and allows them to fill with blood as the blood bounces off the aortic semilunar valve and fills the right and left coronary artery. The left coronary artery branches into the anterior interventricular and circumflex, supplying the interventricular septum, anterior ventricular walls and the left atrium, and the back wall of the left ventricle, while the right coronary artery forms the right marginal and posterior interventricular artery and supplies the right atrium and most of the right ventricle. And so you can see those vessels here. Note again how each of the coronary arteries branches off the base of the aorta, right? And that's why when the heart is in diastole, when the lower chambers are relaxed, they fill with blood, because the blood then flows back towards the heart chamber in an effort to, go to the area of least pressure, right? And then they fill those vessels, and then the heart receives first dibs on the blood that it actually pumps. And it needs that because it is a blood-hungry organ. It does a lot of work. The veins are different. The veins collect blood from capillary beds throughout the heart in the coronary circulation and deliver them to a large vein called the coronary sinus, which empties into the right atrium. The great cardiac vein of the anterior interventricular sulcus contributes. The middle cardiac vein of the posterior interventricular sulcus contributes. And the small cardiac vein from the inferior margin of the heart also contributes. Several anterior cardiac veins empty directly into the right atrium as well. So you can see here how this works. The coronary sinus is pictured on the back side of the heart emptying into the right atrium. And then here you've got the great cardiac vein in the front, okay? And then the middle cardiac vein here in the back, okay? So great in the front, middle in the back, and then the small cardiac vein, which would run approximately the same location that the right marginal artery does for the circulation to the heart muscle. Okay? You can see here again the back of the heart, the location of the coronary sinus, the left ventricle, the right ventricle, the middle cardiac vein, okay, the great cardiac vein coming here, and of course the great vessels, the superior and inferior vena cava, the left and right pulmonary arteries, the aorta, and the pulmonary veins. Angina pectoris is a pain that radiates through the chest, and it's usually the result of a temporary reduction in blood flow to the myocardium. It can also result as a result of cardiac tamponade. The cells are weakened. Myocardial infarction is prolonged coronary blockage and results in areas of death in the myocardium which are replaced with scar tissue because cardiac muscle tissue does not regenerate, and that means that that region of the heart is permanently weakened from that point on. Cardiac muscle cells, as we already noted, are striated and branched and contain intercalated discs and one nucleus per cell. The connective tissue matrix, which is the endomysium here, hooks up to the cardiac skeleton. The T-tubules in this type of muscle tissue are wide and less numerous, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum is simpler than skeletal muscle. There are no terminal cisternae here. They have a lot of mitochondria because they need lots of ATP to do their work. So you can see an actual micrograph of cardiac muscle tissue on the left, and then the components of the intercalated discs, the gap junctions that allow current flow here, and the desmosomes that result in physical attachment of the cardiomyocytes here. And both of those make up the intercalated discs. So those are the intercalated discs and their components. Okay. What this does for the heart muscle is that all of the heart muscle cells are electrically connected, so they act as a functional syncytium. As a result, they can beat as a coordinated unit instead of each cardiomyocyte beating to its own rhythm. One of the things that we'll note about cardiac muscle tissue is that it's capable of autorhythmicity, which is the ability to spontaneously generate action potentials without the need of a nerve impulse. And that results then in a depolarizing wave running across the myocardium, which is followed by a uniform contraction. If we didn't have this electrical connection via the gap junctions, then the heart would essentially quiver, and that would be an ineffective way to pump blood. So you can see here again the components of the cardiomyocytes, the junctions, the interior components, the T-tubules, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, numerous mitochondria and myofibrils. Okay? But again, only one nucleus per cell. This is involuntary striated muscle tissue, which is also autorhythmic. Okay, I will join you guys in the next installment.